Imagine you're standing in the Egyptian desert. The year is 1922. Before you is a doorway sealed for over 3,000 years. No one has breathed that air since the Bronze Age. You hold a candle to a small hole. The flame flickers. And a voice behind you asks, "What do you see?" You whisper, "Wonderful things." But here's the question no one asked that day. What else came out of that tomb? Not gold. Not treasure. Something invisible. Something patient. Something that waited 30 centuries to meet the living. What really killed the people who opened King Tut's tomb? Was it a pharaoh's curse, or something far quieter, far stranger, and far more real? Before we uncover the answer, take a moment, like this video if you love history that questions the story, and subscribe to Little Historical. We separate fact from fiction, one mystery at a time. Now, let's breathe carefully, and step inside. He had been in a fragile state for years, his health quietly crumbling long before he ever laid eyes on the tomb. A violent car accident in Germany years earlier had left him permanently weak, his lungs vulnerable and his defenses perpetually lowered. So when a mosquito landed on his cheek and bit him one evening in Cairo, it was not the bite itself that was lethal. It was what came after. Perhaps it was an absent-minded shave, the blade dragging carelessly over the fresh wound, or perhaps the infection was already there, waiting. But from that single, almost absurdly small cut, something began to bloom. The doctors called it erysipelas, a fiery infection of the skin that spread across his cheek like a curse written in red. Then came the blood poisoning, turning his veins into rivers of fever. And finally, pneumonia, filling his lungs with fluid until he could barely breathe. He fought for weeks, but his body, already broken from the accident years before, simply could not rally. On the morning of April 5, 1923, just 5 months after the tomb had been opened, Lord Carnarvon died alone in a hotel room in Cairo. It was a quiet, agonizing death that should have been a simple, medical footnote. But it was not the death itself that was strange. It was what happened the moment he took his last breath. Across Cairo, the lights of the city flickered and went out, plunging the metropolis into a sudden, inexplicable darkness. And at his English estate, Highclere Castle, his beloved little dog, Susie, let out a long, mournful howl, dropped dead on the spot, at the very same hour. The world looked at these coincidences, at the impossible timing, and asked itself a question that would not be silenced. Was it merely chance, a cruel joke of biology and timing? Or had the boy king finally come to collect what was his? This is where our story truly begins, not in a tomb, but in the tense silence that followed that death, where science would struggle to explain what fear had already decided was true. And so, in that tense silence, fear found its voice. It did not rise from the tomb itself, nor from any inscription carved into stone. In fact, no such curse was ever found inside Tutankhamun's burial chamber. The ancient Egyptians wrote spells for protection, yes, but nowhere did they threaten death upon intruders in the way the newspapers would soon claim. The curse was not born in the Valley of the Kings. It was born in the press rooms of London and New York, where journalists smelled a story far more valuable than gold. When Lord Carnarvon died, the timing was too perfect to ignore. A wealthy man, a sealed tomb, a mysterious infection. And then the strange details began to multiply, each retelling adding a new layer of dread. Someone remembered that at the exact hour of his death, his favorite dog had howled and collapsed. Someone else swore that all the lights in Cairo had gone dark. These were not lies, perhaps, but they were not quite truths either. The power grid in Cairo was notoriously unreliable. And dogs, as any owner knows, grow old and die. But when placed side by side with a pharaoh's supposed revenge, coincidence began to look like conspiracy. The novelist Marie Corelli, a woman who had built her career on the supernatural, published a warning before Carnarvon even fell ill. She claimed that an ancient Egyptian book promised death shall come on swift wings to anyone who disturbed a royal tomb. She had never seen that book. She had invented it. Yet the public devoured her words. Soon, every cough, every accident, every misfortune that befell anyone even remotely connected to the expedition was dragged into the spotlight. A man dies of a heart attack years later. The curse. A visitor catches a cold on the journey home. The curse, taking its time. The media understood something that science did not. People do not want explanations. They want stories. And this story, once unleashed, could not be contained. It spread from newspapers to books, from books to films, from films to the darkest corners of the collective imagination. By the time anyone thought to ask for evidence, the curse had already won. Not because it was real, but because it was believed. And belief, as we are about to see, has a way of making its own truth. That truth would soon find its second victim, then a third, each death feeding the legend until no one could tell where coincidence ended and something far stranger began. And yet, for all the headlines and the whispered warnings, for all the dogs that howled and the lights that flickered, the true culprit was never supernatural. It was something far older, far quieter, and far more patient than any curse. Inside that sealed tomb, where no air had moved for over 3,000 years, life had not died. It had simply waited. Not the life of kings or gods, but the life of the smallest, most ancient organisms on Earth. Mold. Fungi. Bacteria. They had thrived in the darkness, feeding on the organic remains of the burial. The linen, the oils, the resins, the food offerings left for the boy king's journey to the afterlife. The tomb was not a chamber of death. It was an incubator. And when Howard Carter made that small hole in the doorway, he did not just release stale air. He released a cloud of microscopic spores that had been perfecting their survival for millennia. Among them was a particularly dangerous fungus called Aspergillus niger. Invisible to the eye, weightless on the breath, it drifted into the lungs of every archaeologist, every worker, every visitor who stepped inside. For most healthy people, a few spores would do nothing more than trigger a mild cough or a fleeting fever. But for those already weakened, already vulnerable, the spores found fertile ground. They germinated. They spread. They caused a condition called aspergillosis, where the lungs become a battlefield, filling with inflammation and fluid until the body simply cannot draw air. Lord Carnarvon, with his damaged lungs from that long-ago car accident, was the perfect host. The mosquito bite may have been the door, but the mold was the hand that turned the key. And he was not alone. Other members of the expedition reported persistent coughs, strange fevers, and a fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. They blamed the Egyptian heat, the long hours, the stress of discovery. They never blamed the invisible cloud they had been breathing every single day. But here is where the story turned strange again. If mold and fungi were the real killers, then why did so many others walk away completely unharmed? Why did Howard Carter himself, the man who spent the most time inside that tomb, live another 17 years? The answer to that question is not a curse. It is something far more unsettling, and it brings us directly to the survivors, the ones the newspapers forgot, and the quiet truth that the curse was never meant to kill everyone. It only needed to kill enough. And that is the detail the headlines never printed. Because if the curse were real, if some ancient force were truly selecting its victims one by one, then it was remarkably inefficient. Howard Carter, the man who actually broke the seal, who first breathed that ancient air, who spent years inside the tomb handling every artifact, every cloth, every piece of the boy king's earthly remains, he lived until 1939. 17 years after the opening. He died not of a mysterious fever or a supernatural plague, but of lymphoma, at the age of 64, in his London flat, surrounded by the treasures he had unearthed. He was not the exception. He was the rule. Of the 58 people present at the official opening of the sarcophagus, only 8 died within a dozen years. That is a death rate of roughly 14%, which, in the 1920s, was actually lower than the average mortality rate for adults of the same age. The other 50 walked away. They grew old. They told stories. They died, eventually, of heart disease, of old age, of the ordinary catastrophes that claim every human body. So why do we remember the curse? Because the curse is a story, and stories need victims. The newspapers carefully selected the few deaths that looked suspicious and ignored the many that did not. A man dies of pneumonia after visiting the tomb. Front page. A man dies of a heart attack 20 years later, never having set foot in Egypt. Not mentioned. This is called confirmation bias, and it is one of the most powerful forces in the human mind. We see what we expect to see. We connect dots that may not actually touch. And once the pattern is established, every subsequent death, no matter how ordinary, becomes another piece of evidence. There is also a darker possibility, one that the survivors themselves may have felt in their quieter moments. Fear has a physical weight. It raises stress hormones. It weakens the immune system. If you believe you are cursed, your body may begin to act as if it were true. The nocebo effect, the opposite of the placebo, can produce real symptoms from pure expectation. So perhaps the curse did not kill anyone directly, but it may have convinced a few vulnerable minds to help it along. In the end, the tomb did not need a curse. It had something far more reliable: time, biology, and the human willingness to believe in ghosts. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all.